What's up everyone? In this video, we're going to go over more payload configurations in your payload config file. But before we get started, make sure you're subscribed to my channel and enrolled in notifications so you never miss a video I release about PayloadCMS and more. Now let's dive in. In a previous video, we discussed several config options within the PayloadCMS config file. The options we went over in that video should have been plenty to get started with in any project you might be working on, so if you haven't watched that video yet, please do before watching this one. The other video includes descriptions of the two required config options, so you'll want to make sure you understand the DB and secret config options before moving forward. Though we went over several options in that video, we didn't go over a few important configuration options. Let's do that now. The first one is the email field. The email field allows you to configure an email adapter for payload. If this field is not defined, any login-related emails will be logged to the console, which is not very useful. You can set up the email configuration using SMTP, resend, SendGrid, and more. This allows you to send forgot password emails, responses from a form, and much more. Since we don't have an email adapter set up right now, even if we were to type in email into our config file, there's nothing we can do here without getting an error. So we'll remove that for now and discuss email in depth later on. The next is default depth. In order for Payload to hydrate your relationship fields on the front end, you need to include a depth field, which tells Payload how many levels deep in a relationship it should return for a request. The higher the depth, the more expensive the database transaction, so use this feature wisely. You typically won't need to use a depth of more than 1 or 2, so you might want to set that level here instead of typing it in each request on your front end. So we can do that by just typing in default depth, and we'll put it into here. Otherwise, you can set this to 0 and define the depth you want to hydrate only on the front end. It's important to note that depth has no effect in the GraphQL API, only in REST and the local API. This is because GraphQL's depth is based on the shape of your queries. You'll be able to tell if your depth is not sufficient if you only get the item's ID in your response. You can test different depths and what it returns in the API section of the PayloadCMS admin panel of a specific item. Similarly, we have maxDepth. If you'd like some extra protection against malicious queries that might try to use depth to create large requests to your database, you can set a max depth. Normally this defaults to 10, but you can set it to whatever number you'd like. So if you don't anticipate ever needing a depth of more than 3, you can set this to 3 and restrict the max depth across your whole application. So under default depth, we'll add max depth and just add 3. You're also able to set this at the field level if you don't want to restrict depth at the application level. So if you set this as 2 on a relationship field, then no matter what you put in your query, the result will only return relationships up to 2 levels deep. Localization is next. This allows you to manage multiple languages in one CMS. You can use localization to set the locales you want your CMS to manage. This is not internationalization, which you can enable to translate the admin panel as well, but more on that later. You can set your localization object to include an array of string locales, so we could just do English and Spanish that way. We'll also need to include a default locale, which we'll set to English. That will make the errors go away. Instead of using string locale codes, we could also open each of these up as an object. So let's do our label of English with a code of EN. Then for our Spanish code here, we can open that up and then do label Spanish with a code of ES, and then we can set a fallback locale of English. And even if you support any language with writing from right to left, you can do that as well using this more advanced option where we can set our label to a language like Arabic with a code of AR, for example, and then we can do a fallback locale of English. And then at the very end here, we can do RTL and set this to true. So now this will support any right to left writing that we would do in the Arabic locale. If you opt in for a localization, you'll need to provide a default locale as we've done here, using the code of your preferred default language. If no locale is specified in your API queries, then this is the locale that will be used by default. Fallback is true by default, so if you want to have your documents fall back to your default locale, you can just set this to true, which it is by default. If you don't want it to do that, you can set this to false and override that behavior. You can enable localization at the field level by setting localized to true in each field you'd like to have localized. So we can go over to our post config, for example, and go to our title and set localized to true. Similar to localization, you can enable internationalization by going to your config and typing in I18N and opening an empty object. From there, you can add supported languages, again with an empty object, and we'll say that we support EN and ES. So now these get errors, which means that we need to import these packages from PayloadCMS. So we can then use this insert EN from PayloadCMS translations languages and just use that for both our EN and copy this for ES. So now our payload admin dashboard would support both English and Spanish. You can set a fallback language to be whatever you want the default language to be. As of the time of this recording, there are currently 30 supported languages in Internationalization, with English being the default installed with PayloadCMS. So if you want to use English as your fallback language, you don't need to do anything here. It's set like that by default. However, if you wanted to use Spanish, we could set fallback language to be ES. And since that's a supported language here, the language would default then to Spanish. So we'll get rid of that and leave it as an English translated PayloadCMS instance. You should only import and use the languages you plan on supporting so your project doesn't bloat from unused JavaScript. Next up is the serverURL config option. You use the serverURL config option to set the absolute URL of your app. This cannot include any paths, only protocol, domain, and port, which is optional. It's recommended you include this as an environment variable, not because it's secure and should be protected, but so you can set your actual domain as an environment variable when the app is deployed. So to add your server URL, you can just type in serverURL, and we'll just use our local host for now. But we could just set this to be process.env server URL or an empty string. So when you're using your app locally, localhost 3000 would work, but if you want to be able to deploy the app, you'll want to use server URL with an environment variable. Next up is plugins. There are many plugins that are offered by the PayloadCMS team. These are flexible enough where you can create your own plugin if you need to, or use a community-supported plugin as well. We'll cover the available plugins in a separate video, but this is where you define the plugins you'd like to use for your PayloadCMS instance. So up here we do have a plugin placeholder array. This option accepts an array of plugins and their individual configurations. Just like collections and globals, you can either define the plugin within the payload config itself or in a separate file, whichever you prefer. The last configuration option we'll go over in this video is Sharp. If you want to be able to allow your upload collection to crop, set focal points, and automatically resize your media, you'll want to install Sharp and pass it in your payload config. This one is very easy. All you have to do is import Sharp and then type it in your config. PayloadCMS is powerful because of its config-based, code-first approach. The configuration file can be built out even further than this, but most of the other options are going to be use case specific, and you may never even need to use them. Between this video and the previous one, you likely have all the tools you need to create powerful and flexible projects. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and sharing it with others. Have questions or suggestions, please leave those in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Lastly, check to make sure you're subscribed and enrolled in notifications as well. I'll see you on the next one.